Thank you very much for hosting us here. So, again, welcome to all of you on behalf of National Center for Biological Sciences. Those who have not visited or not know about it, it's a research institution of Government of India under the Department of Atomic Energy, which is based in Mumbai. National Center for Biological Sciences, as the name indicates, is a research institution in the area of biological sciences. When we say biological sciences, it's the study of life in itself, right? And we study life across scales in terms of time. For example, origin of life to all the modern life that we see around us, as well as see ourselves as a living organism and see all the capabilities of humans, what makes this possible and what are the different biological mechanisms which manifest for us to understand the external world, right? And also, unfortunately, also how we are able to manipulate the external world, right? The second part of our work is also across the scale of size, from molecules to ecosystem itself. The whole forest ecosystem is a collection of different forms of life, right? And not just one form of life, but there is a biological mechanism by which all of these liquid life forms interact with each other, maintain certain kinds of homeostasis and so forth. And we normally look at the mechanistic details, and it's a very fundamental question that people ask. One of our colleagues who's here, who's going to talk later in the, after Samira Sheikh, another my namesake. He works in the area of origin of life, for example, right? Much before anything that could have seen on a current form. But why we are here? NCBS is also interested in history of science. The reason is the science itself, if you look at it, is not just about what we do today. What people have already generated knowledge. Certain kinds of knowledge is generated, perhaps out of intuition, sometimes with certain kinds of logic, and later, more recently, through experimental validation. Right? And every time some new knowledge is generated, it is subjected to validation, and unless it withstands the test of time, we don't call it as knowledge. In fact, we simply call it as information. Most of the information is usually noise. From noise to information to knowledge, the series of steps, it takes centuries sometimes years. And these days it's much faster simply because connectivity is much better. But people across the world are connected, so things happen much faster. So in that context, we also need to look at the science from the historical perspective. Without looking at the history and philosophy of science, we will not be able to do a good job as a scientist. So NCBS is very much interested in history and philosophy of science. And because we live in the post-colonial, modern, independent India, and much of what we do is sort of emerged in the last 75 to 80 years. And understanding modern science in Indian context, how it started, and how it's sort of grown, how it has evolved, and what are the who are the players, and what are the times in which the discoveries were made, and what are the social factors or other factors which help them to build their hypothesis and validate their hypothesis and so forth. To that extent, we are actually interested in studying history of science of India, contemporary India, and for which we have established archives. Setting up an archive itself is not enough, because most of our scientists are conventional scientists in the way they ask biological questions and then try to address using experiments. But we need, the trained, historians. So we do have a large number of scholars in history of science who work in our campus. So in that context, a few years ago, we instituted what called Obaid Siddiqi chair, named after the founder of NCBS. Obaid Siddiqi himself was very much interested in connecting science to the society and understanding the society from the historical context and so forth. So, and our fifth Obaid Siddiqi chair is Professor Samira Sheikh, who is from the University in the US, and kindly agreed to spend a full year, irrespective of all the visa issues, thanks to you, Samira, spending time with us, and she has actually started a whole new, collection for our archives on maps, cartography, and trying to understand how people are actually building maps, during those days, and part of it is going to be today's talk, and she gave one talk on this just a few days ago at NCBS campus, and the third will be on Sunday at Bangalore International Center. Right? So in that context, I thought it was apt to have her talk here. There are two reasons. The National Law Universities are very close partners in multiple different ways, and also the Vice Chancellor of this university is in the selection committee to select Obaid Siddiqi chair professors. And the third is, you people are interested in history. You need to be interested in studying history much more nowadays than others, simply because every litigation is something to so-called correcting the history, right? So we look at history completely in a different way, and perhaps there could be a meeting of minds somewhere, so that history of science and history of law and history of social dynamics can be studied together. Thank you very much.
A big thank you to NLS, a big thank you to Dr. Samira Sheikh, the NLS communications team, facilities team, catering teams, everyone who's made it possible for us to collaborate on hosting the Obaid Siddiqi lectures this year. My name is Deepika. I'm a part of the team at the archives at NCBS. We're a public collecting center for the history of science in contemporary India, which means that we actively seek out and we preserve material across all fields of science and from across the country. And we preserve things like photos, letters, documents, scientific instruments, other kinds of artifacts from individual scientists, from organizations, from people's movements, and much more in fields ranging from aquaculture to public health to particle physics. In the coming year, our focus is on histories of science in the Karnataka region. And if you'd like to learn more about us, we love having visitors. Please do visit the archives website, archives.ncbs.res.in, or come over and see us in person. We're located in Sadanand. We're open to the public from Monday to Friday, 10:30 a.m. to 5 p.m. If you'd like to join our mailing list to know a little more about what we're up to and events like this, there's a sign-up sheet on the table outside the room. And I'd like to tell you a little about the position of the Obaid Siddiqi chair. It is named after Obaid Siddiqui, the renowned biologist whose sustained vision led to the development and the founding of NCBS. The chair is supported by TNQ Foundation. Every year, the chair is awarded to a distinguished scholar with a substantial body of work that deepens our understanding of the history and culture of science. They're known for transcending disciplinary boundaries in their work and for engaging with the public. They also work closely with the archives at NCBS to reimagine the role of the archive in both academic and public spaces. Today's talk is the second in a series of 3 lectures titled No Country for All Maps. The final lecture, as Dr. Shashi mentioned, is at AIC on the 19th. It's at 5:30 p.m. and we hope that many of you will join us there. I'll hand over to Professor Shashi Turpati, a member of faculty at NCBS, to tell you more about Samira and her work.
Hi, I'm Yadav Shashi from NCBS. Thank you for having us at NLS, and it's a pleasure to introduce Samira as it was in the first calculation. Samira is an associate professor at Vanderbilt University in the US, and as has been mentioned already, she's the 5th holder of the Obaid Siddiqi chair. Samira's work concerns itself with histories, as she says, that emerge from the below and the margins, and the major focus of that kind of work has been on Gujarat, mainly from the 15th to the 18th centuries, asking how regions are made through people's movements, languages, and memories. And across her scholarship, Samira has returned to the question of how large political and cultural formations are built from the ground up. So during the last year at NCBS, in addition to the work that she's done that she's going to tell us about, Samira has brought sort of this sensibility to a wide range of activities, engaging as scientists in those. One of them, as she called historian in the house, sort of brought a lot of us scientists, usually not caring for these kinds of things, into active conversations and engaging conversations about ecologies, land, power, evidence, and so on. And another very interesting series that she brought also was called Fragments from the Archives. As you heard, we have a very well-run and very rich archives at NCBS, and so we would pull out a fragment from those archives and discuss that from a variety of different viewpoints, and that was very nice. Earlier in this year, Samira organized a workshop, Lines of Power, Mapping, Measurement, and the Making of Indian Spaces, bringing together about 70 map enthusiasts from across Bangalore and further. That workshop and her work at NCBS carries that flavor of really looking at maps from a very unique point of view and asking what that tells us not only about the regions, but also she's integrated the ways of science and what science lies hidden in these maps. And if anything from the first talk is an indication, we are all in for an absolute treat. And so with that, Samira, please, over to you.
Be honest, how many of you were up till 2:30 last night? And how many of you wept when the results were declared? Okay, so just a few. You see, clearly you are all very earnest students and professors of law, and I'm so happy to be here among you this afternoon. Thanks for welcoming me back. I had the lovely opportunity to speak to the faculty back in the spring, and now here I am to talk about another project. Before anything, the first Obaid Siddiqi lecture was at NCBS among the scientists, and I'm here among the lawyers, but also some social scientists. I want to express my deepest gratitude to the NCBS community. That's what it looks like. If you haven't visited, you totally should. To Professor Shashi, to the entire community, and to the TNQ Foundation for making this extraordinary year possible for me, and for giving me the companionship and friendship of this incredible team at the Archives, who I hope will be friends and colleagues in the long term. So once again, as Deepika said, please do take this opportunity. This is not just any old archive. It's not dusty in the least. It's a living place where the history of Indian science is preserved with the greatest respect and expertise and ethics. Now, my chair, the Obaid Siddiqi chair, which I have been privileged to occupy for the last year, is named after, of course, the great scientist, visionary Obaid Siddiqi. But my introduction to Obaid Siddiqi was through his wife, an equally distinguished historian, Asya Siddiqi. And it was her work that I first encountered, and only then did I realize that Obaid was Asya's partner. And I think both of them were world makers, institution makers in their own right. And I want, at this moment, to give Asya also a place within this acknowledgements that I am making towards those who have inspired me, hosted me, and given me companionship. Okay. So this is a series of 3 lectures. I called it No Country for Old Maps. And before I get started, like in TV shows, I'm going to give you a quick recap of what was the discussion in the first session. I asked, where are the maps of the Mughal Empire? I made 3 claims. One is that the maps of the Mughal Empire exist, but they were not really commissioned by the Mughals, and they don't exist in any one place. There's no unified archive of Mughal mapping. Second, when we search for these Mughal maps, or rather I should call them early modern maps, we should search not just for maps, but for a wider definition of mapping itself. Mapping needn't result only in maps that look like maps. They may result in a range of products, or no products at all. Some maps are mental, some maps are in the form of verse, some maps are textual, some maps are charts, mathematical tables, astronomical calculations. All of these are forms of mapping. And in order to grasp the range of Indian mapping, the range of Indian cartographies, we've got to open our category of mapping to include different genres. And thirdly, mapping was abundant, but the mappings were not centralized. There was very little standardization of mapping. And so what we see in this early modern era is that there were different purposes for mapping and different methods of mapping, and those resulted in a very wide range of different products, as it were. So we've got to take into account that there's a really wide range, and I'll show you some of those mappings that I have been interested in for many years now. We also had the chance to do a deep dive into this extraordinary map of Gujarat that is in the Baroda Museum and Picture Gallery. And here you see, for the sake of scale, I have put conservator Sindhu Nagaraj in there. And you see that this is a giant map. It's almost 14 feet by 13 feet. And so when it was displayed, it would have had a very profound presence and an effect on those who are viewers. Here is a little bit of a taste of that map, just to give you a sense of where we left the conversation last week. The map was made in about 1750. It included a lot of details about the Gulf of Cambay. It includes the whole of Gujarat. In fact, Gujarat, Saurashtra or Kathiawar, as well as Kutch, are all unified within this map. And it's very much a map that makes a big statement. It makes a statement that Gujarat in 1750 was a unified entity, that it was fertile, it abounded in botanical and zoological abundance. There was water galore. Now Gujarat is a very arid region, it's very hot and dry. So the map makers took a lot of trouble to show all the water bodies that are there in the map. And the scale of it and the kind of massive collection of information that went into making this map kind of provokes awe in whoever the viewer is. And so I suggested that the map summoned a kind of Mughal authority over the province of Gujarat. By showing its rivers, its mountains, its plants, its products, its people, and scores of the small princely states that comprise the region of Gujarat. By showing all of these as part of a unified plane, a two-dimensional plane, the map and the commissioners of the map make this huge statement that Gujarat is both stable and it is abundant. Now, this is exactly the point, around 1750, that Gujarat was about to fall to the Marathas. So it is at a moment of great crisis and great peril, not just for Gujarat, but for the Mughal Empire, of which Gujarat was one of the richest provinces, that this giant map was made, which makes this statement that everything's okay, we're in control. So, building on my observations about this map, I'm going to move on to asking a few broader questions. The first is, very little evidence in any pre-colonial maps of boundaries that are drawn around territories. So we're sort of used to boundaries as defining our existence, right? We carry passports, and whether or not those are signs of citizenship is up for debate. But certainly, passports help us cross boundaries. Our existence is defined by our national documents. But in the pre-colonial era, very, very few maps show political boundaries. And this is not just for South Asia, this is further afield as well. If you didn't have boundaries that are depicted in maps, how did you exert sovereignty over that territory? How was it decided that this is the end of the Vijayanagar Empire and here is where the kingdom of Bijapur starts? If you didn't have those lines drawn in the sand. And thirdly, what changes once lines do start to appear in maps? What changes in maps and what changes in Indian notions of sovereignty itself? Let me try and do a little setting of the context. I'm dragging you back to the 18th century, and those of you who are not historians here will probably remember it as the time of the Mughal Empire is more or less gone, the British aren't yet fully in place, and there's this period of a lot of chaos. Banish that thought. Chaos was not what was happening. Rather, the period between empires was a period of huge diversity, huge commercial entrepreneurship, and a lot of experiments in how to rule. And it is these experiments that result in a new energy in the practice of mapping. Because as new political units are coming into being, you've got to figure out what relationship they have to each other, how land is to be governed, how land is to be parceled out, how land is to be bought and sold, how land can be accurately calculated with the help of trigonometry, with the help of astronomical details. And so this is a landscape which really promotes a lot of innovation in mapping. So let's look at what's happening in the 18th century. This is not a talk about Aurangzeb, call me back, and we'll talk about him some other day, but Aurangzeb dies in 1707, and that is when you really start to see the Mughal Empire's influence kind of shrinking. Cultural influence remains for more than a century, for maybe a century and a half. But political influence continues to shrink through most of the 18th century. There are a number of rulers who, some of the most prominent ones, I have just put in some images. You might recognize some of those. I think you certainly would recognize this one. And these are some of the rulers who succeeded the Mughals. And remember that all of them ruled in the name of the Mughals. They ruled as viceroys of the Mughals. So that's another way of saying that even if the effective power of the Mughals was shrinking, the cultural hold of this idea of the Mughal Empire doesn't really go away even after the British really extend their military power over much of the subcontinent. So this 18th century, which saw these kingdoms, but dozens of others, scores of others, it was a landscape of making pragmatic alliances. And it was a landscape in which sovereignty was no longer concentrated at the center, rather it was divided up, and there was a lot of hierarchy. Indian society has always had hierarchy. But this was a moment when, because there were so many units jostling for political power, there was no scope to change your status in life. There was a lot of potential for entrepreneurship. There were a lot of changes of regimes. Some of these regimes lasted only a few decades. And so you see that while regional regimes consolidate power, they also continue to sort of pay at least lip service to this overlay of Mughal administrative, which is power, which is now more or less increasingly a fiction. So then when you have these dozens of kinds of rulers, dozens of kingdoms, how do they draw lines between them? How do they decide that here's the end of my territory, here's the end of Tipu's territory, here's the start of the Nizam's? Now, when you look at modern maps, when we see modern maps of the 18th century or the Mughal Empire or Tipu Sultan, modern map makers draw a line around the territory that they think is the extent of the territory that Tipu controlled. But in actuality, at the time, nobody drew maps with these territories drawn within them. Rather, the limits of a king's influence, a king or queen's influence, or a chieftain's influence, or a warlord's influence, was usually in the form of relationships. To which village could they extract taxes from? That village formed the boundary. Where was tribute actually collected? Where was the check post along the roads where travelers would be asked to present their credentials or pay some taxes, customs dues? What were those locations? So instead of drawing lines in the sand, the kingdoms of the 18th century and before construed the limits of their power as the limits of where they could exert effective political control. Yeah? And once again, there's a little fuzziness here. As I said, the Mughal Empire's cultural control extends much beyond its actual power. Similarly, at times, Tipu's actual control would have extended much less than maybe the cultural power of his rule. So in this kind of setting, when everyone's trying to figure out now this village on the outskirts of Bangalore, should it be paying revenues to the Nizam or to Tipu? When these questions have to be decided, when boundary issues have to be decided, land specialists are kings. Land specialists, people who understand how land is actually governed and taxed. Right? So you get a lot of the sort of power brokers of the 18th century are people who are specialists in land. These include, terminology from Western India includes Desais, Deshpandes, Majmudars, Kanun Gos, and again these are all Mughal terms which sort of have different regional varieties in different places. But these are the people, and sometimes these are not just individuals, these actually function as family firms, and there's a lot of prominent women involved as well. So these are the people, these revenue officials, tax officials, people who adjudicate, who assess, who kind of double check the amount of tax that is required by the country. These are the people who are key to this new political order. As Mughal dominion fades, these folks are often left without patrons, and so their skills come on the market. They are willing to offer their skills to whoever wants them. And often, within their documentation are maps. They contain their documentation about which village owes how much money in revenue. Is often in the form of maybe not maps as maps, but maps as revenue charts or tables or descriptions of land parcels or field books which would calculate how much a field is, the dimensions of a field and how much cotton it is supposed to produce, how much rice it's supposed to produce. So these were all the tools of some of the new map makers of the 18th century. So knowing the land means that you can turn that knowledge into also making maps and offering your services to people who are willing to pay for them. So So as territories and jurisdictions changed, knowledge of the land became ever more important, but it was always unevenly distributed, locally held. It was expensive, you had to pay for it. And it tended to be guarded very closely by the individuals and families who held it. And so therefore we never see a kind of centralization of land-based knowledge. The Mughals tried, failed, and in the 18th century there was no central power that could centralize this information, not until British power and from the 1820s onwards, and we'll get to that. Okay, so in this scenario, who were the people and where were the places where a lot of maps were being produced? And here's where I want to invite people to come and join the search for non-European mappings of India. I haven't even been able to find a single non-European map in Bangalore. Please, they must be out there. Help me find them. They must be there in the rest of South India, Eastern India. My own research has concentrated primarily on Gujarat and a little bit on Northern and Western India in a sort of broader sense. Okay, so here's a century of maps. And before we get started, I wanted to just have you look at this really interesting quotation from Pushkin that is cited in an article by Brian Hardy. The Tsar says, "My son, what engrosses you? What is this?" Fyodor says, "A map of Muscovy, our royal kingdom. From end to end, look farther, Moscow is here, here's Novgorod, there's Astrakhan. The sea is there, here's the virgin forest land of Perm, and there is Siberia." The Tsar says, "And what might this be? A winding pattern tracing?" Fyodor says, "It's the Volga." Tsar is delighted. How splendid. The delicious fruit of learning. Thus at a glance, as from a cloud, to scan our whole domain, its boundaries, its towns, its rivers. This is what a king's ambition might be, to create a mapping of their entire terrain. Very, very few of them ever achieved it. But some tried. And one of those who did, in this century of maps, and notice here from this graph that we have very, very few mappings from the 16th century, from the 17th century. In the 18th century, there is a dramatic rise. In the 19th century, there's a lot of mappings, but most of those are European mappings. So I'm kind of not counting them in my list of mappings. So one of the rulers who spends a lot of time, energy, and expertise in creating mappings, collecting mappings, is Sabai Jai Singh of the Kachwaha lineage, who ruled Amer. He had a karkhana or a workshop which was called the Surat Khana, and there were a number of genres of maps that were both made there but also collected from other places over there. And the collection is not currently accessible, but luckily we have a catalog that was made of most of the maps of the Surat Khana and the Poti Khana, and there are over 400 maps that were made during the period of that are catalogued from the early modern period in the City Palace Museum in Jaipur. Here is the man himself, and as you can see, neither his predecessors nor his descendants matched his passion for maps, for both, again, producing and collecting them. And of course, many of us know Sabai Jai Singh more because of the great astronomical monuments of his reign, the Jantar Mantars, of which you see a few here. This is from Jaipur, this is the one in Delhi. This is the Vedshala in Ujjain, and this is Man Singh's observatory that is in Varanasi. Along with astronomy, which again, it's important to remember that Savai Jai Singh, in the late 17th century, that's when he lived, was very deeply influenced by the great Timurid Sultan stroke astronomer Ulugh Beg, who ruled Samarkand. And he tried to implement many of the kind of astronomical techniques of Ulugh Beg here, and along with the Jantar Mantars, he was also the possessor of a telescope and of several other astronomical instruments. Now, I'm not trying to say that astronomy at the Jaipur court was directly connected with making maps. We can't say that yet because we haven't been able to study the maps in the City Palace Museum. So again, there is scope for any of you who's looking for a PhD project. But since there was astronomical knowledge, since there was a lot of interest in mathematics and in instrumentation and in maps, there was the potential for these sciences, these knowledge fields to intersect and to be connected to one another. But at this point, we can't make that claim. Another territory which saw a lot of interest in mapping, but very different kinds of maps, was the Maratha Empire. You see a range of kinds of maps. They included fort plans, military formations, called vyuhas, regional and coastal maps, fort maps, revenue maps, river maps. This is a painting of the Vijayadurga fort. This is a hydrological painting of a sangam of two rivers. So there were dozens of maps that were produced that I know of, and probably there are many, many more that have still not been identified. Now, in the Maratha maps, the emphasis is slightly different from the Jaipur ones. The spatial intelligence in these maps is often topological. There's very little interest in scale. They usually preserve route sequences, river alignments, administrative groupings, like they tell us, which are the revenue units, the parganas, the sarkars, and so on, and strategic relationships between places, but without much interest in scale or survey proportions, such as latitude, longitude, bearings, and so on. So maps tended to organize space where action could take place, where revenue comes from, where troops could pass, which forts controlled which valleys, and so on. There were also, and across northern and western India, a large number of route mappings. And here you see a wonderful map of the territory between Ajmer and Ahmedabad. And you see those zigzag lines. Now those have been added by Taj Sangwan, who is working with me who's worked with me and spent a lot of time on this map. These have been added to demonstrate how the map functions. So it tells you how the relationship between places that are depicted in the map. And here, the zigzag lines in the center depict passes through the Aravalli Mountains. And those distances are always accompanied by the exact distance in kos or kuru that is indicated. So, you can calculate what your journey is going to be like. And you have, very interestingly, nodes of commercial importance that are also indicated in this map. Now, this was the territory, Ajmer was Mughal territory, Ahmedabad was Mughal territory. In between were a bunch of Rajput kingdoms, most prominently that of Marwar. So this map, we think, was made to perhaps assist Aurangzeb during his conquest of Marwar in the 1680s. But that's the hypothesis, we can't prove it. And here you see in detail some of the there it is. Some of the towns that you would be likely to pass, and the place names both in Persian and Devanagari, but also here you see Panch Kos, here you see the distances that are marked between places, yeah? So this kind of route map is pretty common. Here's another one, a large map of northwestern India, that's in the National Archives. And you see here, this is a copy made in the 19th century of an older 18th century map, so there's annotations in English. But you see very detailed information on routes that is provided over here. Sometimes such route maps would be very elaborately painted. And there is a beautiful specimen in the British Library that looks like this. And again, you have this is the road that you're passing through, and that's more or less in a straight line. But you also pass through forts and places of interest. Topographical details are provided, rivers, bridges, fords, and so on. And so that is what you would need for making your journey successfully. Other than route maps, there is also along the coasts of India a wide variety of seafaring maps. Here's one of the most spectacular examples, a scroll map which was made by Gujarati or Kutchi sailors, pilots, which is a map of the Red Sea. So it starts from Babul Mandeb, from Aden, at the mouth of the Red Sea, and it takes you all the way up to Jeddah. It has, these are symbols for stars that you would use to navigate to particular ports. So each star or asterism has a particular symbol. If you know that symbol, then you can easily navigate it. Some of these lines also include sailing times. So if you have reached your destination in, say, 4 hours, then you're probably, way off where you need to be. You also have shoreline silhouettes. So if you are thinking of hitting Darjeeling, you should probably see a hill on the coastline before you hit it, so you know that you're in the right place. So a scroll like this would give a pilot a huge amount of information with which to navigate within this map, within this terrain. And there's also a number of different kinds of boats and also places of interest on the shore. Now this map has been the subject of study by 2 scholars. I strongly recommend reading it. It's a very, very thorough and systematic study. And it really shows how seafaring was something that was not just the domain of kind of illiterate fisher people and sailors. There was a lot of knowledge that was being produced and being transmitted between the oral, the memorized, the generational knowledge, as well as the visualized kind of knowledge that you're seeing here. Here's another map of Gujarat, of the coast of Gujarat, the Gulf of Cambay. And here you see the port of Cambay. This is a map I studied about 20 odd years ago. Now this contains instructions on navigating from Diu to Surat. Yes, Surat. I will spend more time on this map in the next lecture, but I just wanted to give you a teaser that this is a fascinating map, and I recently, with the help of Professor B.S. Shailaja, been able to crack something very interesting about it. Come back for more. There were also hydrological maps. This is a 40-foot long map, scroll map, which is 8 feet high, of the Shah Jahanabad Canal that stretched from the Red Fort to into Haryana. Now, okay, I said at the start that there is no centralization of conventions. Yeah, you don't see the same kind of modes of depicting territory or routes or places throughout India. There's a lot of diversity. But we're moving towards a degree of standardization. There are certain features that start to be seen from map to map. This is from the Mughal map that I discussed last week. But this kind of depiction of towns as kind of surrounded by forts, sometimes by double fort walls, this mention of the Per, which means Pargana, this is a revenue district, that depiction we start to see in more and more maps from across South Asia. So there are certain conventions that are starting to become standardized, but there is no central authority which will say, okay, here's how we're going to make maps. Here's the key, or here's the sort of chart with which we are all going to we're all going to make maps. And part of the reason for that is that unlike in Europe, where the printing press, where maps started to get printed from the 16th century, and so the print plate required for certain conventions to be uniform across territories. In India, maps were always handmade, and made for either patrons or for user communities. And so that level of standardization just never takes place, although, as I am suggesting, that there's a certain degree of mutual comprehension that we are starting to see by the middle to end of the 18th century. Here's the depiction of different kinds of towns and pilgrimage places. Right. So the map that I just showed you was made around 1750. Don't know the exact date. About 20 years later, there's a new character in the conversation, and I'm going to spend the next few minutes telling you about it. This was the 1770s, were a time when in Bengal you've got the Governor Generalship of Warren Hastings. You've got the East India Company really establishing itself in Bengal. The Mughal Emperor Shah Alam, those of you who read William Dalrymple's The Anarchy will know that he was on the run most of the time. He was under the protection of the Marathas much of the time. He gets captured and blinded in 1788. And in the south, of course, you've got Hyder Ali and then Tipu Sultan, who made Mysore the East India Company's most formidable opponents. So we are going to go back to Gujarat. At the beginning of the century, Ahmedabad was the capital of the Mughal province. It still was the capital. And the greatest port of Western India, that is Surat, was governed through a complicated arrangement including company officials, Mughal officials, and so on, very complicated. But by 1753, Ahmedabad, which you see this whole territory is Ahmedabad, had fallen to the Marathas, and the Mughal governor of Gujarat fled to Cambay. Now I should remind those of you who didn't come to last week's talk that this map has east on top. So you've got to turn your head to see it in the orientation to which we are accustomed. This is Rajasthan up here, and this is the Saurashtra Peninsula. So Ahmedabad, so the Mughals basically abandoned Ahmedabad, flee to Cambay, and that's where they get settled. And that's where it's from the descendants of the last Mughal governor that this map was purchased in the 20th century. And it's during this period that we come to hear about a remarkable man called Sadanand. He was a Brahmin. He lived in Cambay. He formed a very close relationship with the British resident in Cambay, a man called Charles Mallet, who later on went to be the resident at the Peshwa's court in Pune. Sadanand was a bit of a polymath. He knew Gujarati, Sanskrit, Persian, and almost certainly English as well. Because one of his friends says that he read all the encyclopedias and books that were in the East India Company station's library over there. He was particularly fond of one encyclopedia that I've been trying to identify. He, in 1781, he met a man called James Forbes, who went on to write a book called Oriental Memoirs. And he presented Forbes with a set of kind of small index cards on which he made these little paintings of different kinds of soldiers and different kinds of holy men of Gujarat, but specifically of Cambay. And so basically he's trying to give his friends, there's no sign that he's being paid. He's trying to give his friends some sense of, if you see a guy looking like this, looking a bit like Gandhi, then you probably know that he's a sannyasi. So here are the signs that you would check. Here is a jogi with his colorful cloak. Here is a brahmachari, a Kabir Panthi, a Nanak Panthi, and a Sayyid. So you get a sense of the sort of diversity of religious folks who are hanging around Cambay as well. But what is more important for our purposes is that he makes this map. Now the last map I showed you was giant, 14 feet by 13 feet. This is much, much smaller. It is only about 44 centimeters by 40 centimeters. So it's really maybe A3 size, about that. And while the giant Mughal map has about 120 place names, this has more than 400. So Sadanand packs in a huge amount of information into this map. It is written in the Devanagari script. It has latitude and longitude grid. It has a compass rose, as it is called, and it has a very fascinating cartouche, which I will get to in a few minutes. Now, this map was made sometime in the 1780s. It was presented to a visiting Polish botanist who was traveling around trying to figure out how cotton was cultivated in Gujarat. And because Mr. Hove pasted it into his journals, it has survived in the British Library. Otherwise, who knows, it may not have reached us. And this was the map that the British cartographer James Rennell used for the Gujarat part of his map that he went on to make. He made several versions of it. This version of the map doesn't show Sadanand's influence much, but he says in his memoirs that Sadanand's map was the source of his understanding of Gujarat. Okay, so let's look at this map a little more closely. Now, one thing to remember is that I told you Charles Mallet is the British resident in Gujarat. This is a time when Mallet is kind of got empire-building fantasies. And he thinks if we are able to capture the entire region of this region, of the Gulf of Cambay, then we capture the sort of central economic axis of Western India. And then we can rule it very effectively. So there's a lot of interest in mapping this area, so that military campaigns can be launched, that there can be a lot of accurate collection of data about revenue, about cultivation, about crops, etc. So all of that, there's a lot of interest in this area at that point in time. Okay, so let's return to the map. Sadanand shows us Marwar, the Indus River, which exits into the Arabian Sea. He shows us Mewar. This is the Gulf of Cambay, where you see a lot of sandbanks and stippling. And you see somebody has written in English, Maratha country. Right? And this is the region ruled by the Marathas of Pune, but also the Gaikwads of Baroda. And it's into this map that he puts this vast amount of information. We see that these are all 464 place name points that Taksh has very painstakingly put into QGIS. You see this sort of density of how does he know all this? How does he know how to calculate the positions of 464 places within Gujarat? He gives us the latitude, longitude frame around the map. So Taksh added the grid to it, and so we see how how kind of detailed and rich this is, and from that grid, he calculated the latitude, the bearings of all these places, 464 places, and the majority of them are pretty much close to modern day values. What Sadanand also does, and here we see that the strongest base of information that he has, the most sort of secure information, not surprisingly, is around the Gulf of Campi. Right? So this is the area where also we hear that he surveyed it himself, and so there's a lot of density of place names, but this is also the area that the British want to capture and control. So there's a kind of, this is sort of fitting in with everybody's aims and objectives. And what you see for the first time in an Indian map are political boundaries. 1780s, they have not been seen before. And here, these kind of shading shows you the kind of boundaries that Sadanand made, but I'll get to those in a second. And here you see some of the place names, the density of place names that are in this map. First named mapmaker of Gujarat. There are some map makers in other parts of India, if you think of mappings more broadly, that we can name the artist, but this guy, at least for Gujarat, the first one whose name we know. And it's also the first Indian map with dotted lines for administrative boundaries. So you see these dotted lines. Okay? Let's take a closer look at these dotted lines. In the map, in any map, a line does a lot of work. A line implies that its relationship or jurisdiction is a spatial object. It's a spatial kind of polygon. It implies that different spatial units can be placed alongside one another and compared to one another. It makes territories portable, comparable, copyable, and potentially those lines become where adjudication of authority can take place. Yeah? Again, first time this is happening in an Indian map. And it suppresses ambiguity about who's in charge. It suppresses the idea of shared or layered rights, and it suppresses the idea of negotiated authority. Yeah? It makes things fixed. Lines in the sand are fixing territory and making it portable, copyable, and adjudicable. So, for Sadanand's audience, the fact that a Brahmin of Campi, a genius, they call him a man of uncommon genius, the fact that he is making this map in a mode that they understand, and with all this knowledge packed into it, that is an enormous sort of signifier of the importance of the information that is carried within it. And the fact that he uses lines within the map, uses this kind of European cartographic language that further enhances the sort of reliability of this map. This is not just a native map, which has these layered and contested jurisdictions. This is a map where there are lines in the sand, and so therefore this can be a worthy model on which to base subsequent mappings. Yeah. So the question arises is, how did Sadanand make this map? And there's a lot that can be said here, and I'll try and raise just 2 or 3 points because I know time moves on. One question is, did he use European maps as models? Possibly for the coastal areas. This is the map from 1782 that kind of, pretty much maps onto the same territory. And this is made before Sadanand, so chances are in the East India Company's library, he also looked at, published maps that were already made, but we don't know. For the interiors of Gujarat, no European had access to 464 place names placed on a lat-long grid and available for accurate bearings in that sense. What else does he do? He puts in a scale bar. Once again, something that Europeans would understand. So you have 60 miles associated with one gaj. You also have this compass rose, which tells you the cardinal directions. And here you have a really charming little vignette, which recalls a lot of picturesque renditions of the Indian landscape, again in a mode that might be accessible to the English. As you know, a little temple, a little palm tree, and so on. But it is in the cartouche that my sense is that Sadanand really puts in an authorial statement, a statement of his authority over this territory and over this map, that I think is worth spending a moment on. So what does this say? Tat pato yama gurjara bharitrayaha krita. This map of the territory of Gujarat is made by Vyas Sadanand, and I have made it in a way Balavabodh. So Balavabodh is the term that is used for the Devanagari script. It's used for the language that the script that children learn, a language that Bala children can learn or can have both of. But but of course his audience is the British. And so he is saying that even you, the Brits, can figure out what this map is about. I made it in such a simple and accessible way that you can understand what is going on here. And I suspect that the cartouche also includes a self-portrait of Sadanand. I think he's putting himself in this map. Maybe this is him, I don't know, but I suspect this is the one. And I think that's a little bit of a knowing tip of his turban to European convention, but inserting himself into this very European kind of language of cartography. He's also inserting his caste position, his gender, his subjectivity into a map that otherwise is pretty blank. There's nothing very pretty to look at. It's kind of facts. Yeah? So, for Sadanand's company audience, the map carries this authority of the learned Brahmin and a local elite who could make Gujarat legible in a newly valued geographical language. But he doesn't disappear into that language. He adopts the grid, the scale, the compass rose and the boundary line, but the cartouche asserts that he composed this map. He has control of the knowledge of Gurjar land, and thus he is signing this act of translation that he carries out. Okay. Now the modern imagination is, as we all know, deeply wedded to this idea of the tangibility of borders. International borders, as we all know, are heavily policed. There are checkposts, there are passports, visas, the rest of it. The consequences of drawing lines in the sand also, we know very well, have huge impacts on livelihoods, on persons, on identities. And in India, we know what drawing of the Radcliffe line did in 1947. It still leaves so many unfinished stories. But even within states, there are checkposts. Even within the states of India, you pass through different jurisdictions. You have conflicts over what entitlements different states are entitled to. The water conflicts, for instance, between Karnataka and Tamil Nadu are a good example of that. Modern India's international and internal boundaries are products of layered colonial and post-colonial settlements. They are legal and political constructions. They are not usually natural facts. They are not usually rivers or mountains. The consequence consequences of internal or international borders have huge material effects. But pre-colonial jurisdiction may give us a way to think beyond the fixity of borders that we have become so used to in our current imagination. What if we were to think of a world in which the points of friction were not international or state borders, but natural borders and towns, cities? It is to enter cities that you would need some kind of a pass or passport or pay taxes. What if we were to think of South Asia as a conglomeration of great and expanding cities? And we are seeing that in practice. When we think of Bangalore and the migration to this great city constantly, just stretching the idea of Bangalore's location within Karnataka. It's making it more and more an Indian, pan-Indian city. And that's causing a lot of political resentment. What if the 18th century gave us a way to think of cities, semi-republics as part of the way to move forward beyond our current gridlocks? Pre-colonial maps, as I've suggested, to recap, pre-colonial maps give us fields of knowledge. Our task is to reconstruct the political and social circumstances that made such mappings possible, to ask which conventions persisted across regimes even to the present day, and to identify which graphical, textual, mathematical, structural forms acquired new legal and administrative authority. Did Sadanand's dotted lines mark the moment at which everything changed? Does the dotted line in the 1780s mark the moment when mapping became legal, administrative, and extractive? I would say no. Mapping had long served law, administration, revenue, warfare, pilgrimage, commerce. There is a shift with the arrival of the dotted line when layered jurisdictions turn into bounded territories. But I would say that the pre-colonial world of mapping still lives with us today. Just to quickly recap, the 18th century was a period of huge cartographic experimentation and plurality. It's not a period of chaos. Sadanand's work is an act of both collation and translation, combining local knowledge and late Mughal classification with emerging European graphical conventions. And finally, European cartography, as we see it, the great trigonometric survey started in Bangalore. It didn't change everything overnight. It became dominant institutionally, but it didn't entirely displace older mapping practices, either epistemologically or socially. In my final talk, I hope to see some of you at BIC on Sunday. I will take up the question of what happens next. I will try and show how after Sadanand, lines do harden and come to shape modern identities, legal claims, and distribution of resources. Yet, what I also want to show is that modern mapping never fully replaces the spatial worlds that underlie it. And my final talk will ask, even if hardened boundaries became the norm and became legally justiciable and stripped away a lot from pre-colonial mappings, what can we do to make those submerged spatial worlds still relevant, still alive, and still politically visible even today? Thank you.
Thank you for that enthralling, masterful talk.
I would willingly skip dinner for another one after this, but we'll open the talk to questions. Maybe we will do 2 rounds of questions, collect 3 or 4 if there are any. And for those of you at the round table, you can pass the mic on to people at the back. So if we could, there's one hand there. Can we collect a few questions? Are there any other questions? There's one here. All right, please.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for walking us through the early modern maps elaborately. So my question is, I also listened to this talk recently on Tupaya's map, which is I was able to find very interesting parallels. Tupaya was a Polynesian navigator who helped Europeans chart the Pacific Islands. Now, one question that I have is, did the pre-colonial ways, so I want to broadly talk about maps as one serving a technical purpose and 2 serving a symbolic purpose. And modern maps have a very important role to play in the political imagination in the popular imagination. For instance, maps are sentimental, how the subject population looks at map. So, did the pre-colonial ways of mapping serve only a technical purpose? Was it used only by the ruling elite and the bureaucracy? Or was it also symbolic? Did it contribute to the creation of a nationalist consciousness or something like that? That's the question. Thank you.
If we start to think of beyond maps and towards mappings as a much more capacious category of generating different kinds of affect, then the answer is yes. Because mappings can be made of landscapes, can be made of cities, can be made of emotions, can be made of a range of different human experiences, not just connected to geographical data. Yeah? So here's where I would suggest that the answer is yes, but with qualifications. And here's where we have got to do a lot of contextualizing of what kind of audience would be able to access what kinds of mappings. Right? So if you've got sort of non-textual mappings of indigenous peoples who use these mappings to understand the territory within which they practice pastoralism or foraging, that is one kind of mapping as well. But also, on the other hand, you have map paintings, such as my friend and colleague, Professor Deepti Khera, has done wonderful work on the great map paintings of Udaipur, which have a very strong purpose of inviting affect and identification with the kind of mood of a place. So it really depends on who the mappers are and who the intended users are. Over time, a map might be made for the delectation of a king, but it may be passed around more widely among subjects. But the kind of contextualizing that needs to be done to think about how mappings worked, both as symbols and as sort of practical objects. We need to do a whole lot more work on a whole lot more genres before anything kind of conclusive can be said about that. But certainly there is, the idea of nationalism in maps is very much connected to the idea of boundaries around a very bounded territory. And that's what's set in motion in the late 18th century.
Oh, all right. Hello, thank you so much for your wonderful talk. This was fascinating. I'm neither a historian nor a lawyer. I'm a literature student. And I was really, so I have a sort of general question. I was really interested in the dissonance you were marking between sort of pre-colonial understandings of sovereignty and territory and the colonial and the post-colonial regimes and how that changes. And actually to your last point about nationalism, I was wondering how much emphasis would you put to the modern nation state and the sovereignty of the modern nation state as the cause for limiting centralized ideas of territory building. By which I mean, do you think that pre-colonial understandings of spatiality are undermined by the modern nation state? And how much can we critique or push back on that very construction through the work?
So, sure, please.
Yeah, good evening. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful talk. When you were speaking, I was reminded a little of what I read in my constitutional law course by the eminent jurist H.M. Seafarers. He was very famous for his critique of the reorganization of states in India based on language, where he famously said that we rejected the two-nation theory just to break ourselves up into 14 new nations. So my question would be, in the modern, the post-colonial era, that all that is happening now, you also alluded to how maps create tensions between states within the country, and to the previous question as well. It wasn't purely language that divided these states. There was a rich cultural, geographic, administrative history as well that led to the division of these states. So how would you say that it impacts, say, daily life? The city of Anandpur, for example, which falls on the border of Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh, it's very difficult to figure out which state it is in, and I for a long time did not know which state it was in. So how would you think, in the modern era where we are so fixated on even pride in the state we belong to, how do you think the dotted lines affect everyday life? Thank you.
I think I could combine my answers, if that's okay. So let's think of how the image of India determines our sense of identification with it. And I think Sumati Ramaswamy's work on the notion of Mother India, personified as a map, but also a mother goddess from the Swadeshi movement, is very much an illustration of how this idea of a map becomes very strongly associated with feelings of reverence towards the nation, because reverence towards the goddess. Now, that sort of drawing lines in the sand is a very powerful rhetorical device, and it has affected, and Indian history in the 20th century and the 21st is testament to the fact that both international and state borders have a profoundly redefining effect on our identity. Yeah, we've got to make choices. Are you on this side or that side of the border? These questions then have to be adjudicated by law courts. The enclaves of Bangladeshis within Bihar and Bengal were only adjudicated a few years ago. They take decades to figure these things out. Where do you belong? Are you from Andhra or I'm from Karnataka? That is very much connected with this constantly, this motion towards adjudicating where boundaries are to the last inch. Yeah? So that you then have to make choices between places, right? Now, when the map was drawn between Syria and Jordan, the British, of course, mapmakers used a very thick blue pencil. And so there was endless debate about where exactly the border is, because the thick blue pencil on the map corresponds to 250 meters of boundary territory. So, that leaves a lot of ambiguity, and so then there is only the only way forward with hard linear boundaries is to make that line thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner until it amounts to this very thin line along which you have to make decisions, right? So what my suggestion is that pre-colonial maps give us alternative ways of thinking about identity as being something not connected to that linear, bounded notion of a nation, but perhaps gives us the ability to think of our identity in a more mobile way. I'm not going to discuss the question of international boundaries, but within India, what if somebody who lived in Anandpur was able to states, to claim both identities, to move seamlessly within them, but to claim the Anandpur as their identity. What if that was the place, that was the situation, location for their identity, as happens in pre-colonial maps? You are from a place, a specific place bounded maybe by a fort wall. Not something abstract like a state or a kingdom. That's there, it does its own thing. You have your final allegiance to the nation or the kingdom, but your practical day-to-day identity is connected to your location, and that location can move.
I think our friend from Anandpur is feeling very good about not having to choose. We'll take one more round of questions. Rinku, one there, and one. 4 questions, is that okay? Not too overwhelming.
Okay, help me remember them.
So, Samira, what you've said is consistent with the idea that boundaries have always existed. So, for example, within the palace, there could be a boundary about who can go up to here and no more. Or within the court, there's a boundary, there's a space. Right? And so we use the word linear a lot with these dotted lines that you are asking us to think about. So we are saying that modern boundaries are linear and they get more obsessed with territory, but boundaries of various kind have kept people apart from each other. Right? They've been as problematic in the past too. So I don't have to think that pre-colonial boundaries may have been liberating geographically, but the notion of boundary was also emancipatory or anything like that. Right? So boundaries are a feature of human interaction, something like that. Was a question, right? Yes, thank you.
Samira, thank you for yet another interesting lecture. My question is about Sadanand's map, and you talked about maps being created for a particular audience by a particular person. Now, was this map commissioned by the British? Do you have information on that? Because it seems like, I mean, before this map, obviously the the political condition of what was India was very much in flux, which reflects in multiple kinds of renditions of geographical space. But now it seems as though Sadanand is aware of a power which is consolidating itself. The British are also aware of the need to incorporate local knowledge, and he's clearly an authority. So, was this map commissioned by the British? Because maybe he's recognized that British authority is already very strong in the western part of India. The British need to know more about this very strategically located province from the point of view of empire. So just a little more I would like to know about Sadanand's motive in making this map.
Thank you. Hello?
Hi. During our whole conversation, I was very much thinking about Arab cartographers who precede even European cartographers, and at that time I was thinking about how the Abbasids were aware of Sindh as Had al-Mashriq, which basically referred to the sort of permeable border. So it's a different social imagination altogether, right? And it refers to this sort of different world that understands borders differently. And that led me to as to what you said, reading maps is reconstructing political and social imaginations, and that itself is so striking and strikingly interesting. And so the question I actually had was not so much a technical one, but rather a personal one, because I'm not a law folk here. I'm reading my BA here, so I did history for a year now, so it's been deeply interesting. And in that, I remember reading the works of Muzaffar Alam and Sanjay Subramaniam, who read a letter from a Banya merchant, and there's this contestation of sovereignty that you're seeing there. And like you mentioned, now you have borders, and there's this invocation of new sovereignties. It's it's different ways of looking at the past. So I wanted to ask you, why maps? What has got you so deeply enthused to read maps, to look at history through maps, and what has that sort of personally informed you by, and how does that sort of enhance your experience as a historian? And why would you ask students to take up maps, to do more work on maps as students of history? Yeah.
Thank you. Clearly, our students are reading closely and making connections across texts. Last question here.
Thank you so much for the talk, Professor Sheikh. My question is about, again, Sadanand Vyas and his relationship with his own sort of authorial authority. And to that effect, I wanted to ask about the cartouche and the vignette, which is really fascinating to me because it has elements of landscape, but it also has that relationship between the text of addressing its audience as you know, as a less knowledgeable audience, as well as the suggestion that the portrait on the top might be his own. But then what happens to the portrait at the bottom, because that looks like a very interesting caricature of something that, again, I've seen of caricatures of Europeans along this time. So is this like a cheeky insertion of authorial authority with this large construction of the map of Cambridge?
Thank you. Let me take those four. Boundaries as a feature of social organization. Lecture on Sunday. It's literally called A Short History of Boundaries in India, and I want to try and get to how do we get from the organizational propositions of pre-colonial maps to an understanding more deeply and broadly of caste, of labor, of segregation, of authority, of sovereignty. So that's where I'm hoping to reach by Sunday. So for that thought. Two questions on Sadanand. The question of whether it was commissioned is a slightly complex one. Because now, the guy whose album the map is pasted into says that Charles Mallet, who was the resident at Cambridge, asked Sadanand to make a map of Gujarat. And that Sadanand traveled into the hinterland himself to do some survey. We do not know anything about whether any money changed hands. I have not seen this confirmed in any other source, which, although several other Englishmen talk about Sadanand, praise his genius, they just say that he just made this map. What is more, there was at least one more copy of this map that was made. So this is the one that ends up in the Polish botanist's album, but another was made which ends up with James Rennell, who makes the great map of Hindustan. That I have not yet found. So it would seem that once Sadanand made this map, he was also able to make copies of it, which would suggest that since you asked for more context, that's basically all I can say about the circumstances in which it was commissioned. To Ankita's question, yes, I think that's a European down there. And I think that is such a layered cartouche that I need art historians to help me figure it out. I've already had several art historians kind of, help me through some of the aspects of this. And, I think there's a lot you can say about it, but there's also, it would remain hypothetical in the absence of finding more about Sadanand. Now, there's a lot more drawings, paintings, playing cards that he painted on the backs of, a diagram of indigo production. He did a lot of stuff that I have found, but I haven't yet found any kind of ego documents. This is what I was trying to do. So a lot will remain hypothetical. We are welcome to read what we like, just as his English friends were welcome to read or not comprehend what they saw. Great question about the Abbasid understanding of the Hadul Mashriq. Now here is a key distinction between a border and a frontier. A border is something that is a line in the sand. A frontier is something, it's a movable territory that you can defend with. So the HUD in this context technically is a frontier and not a border, right? So although they're loosely translated to kind of mean one or the other, but here's where none of these Abbasid or any pre-colonial maps, including European maps, dotted lines or lines to mark political territory appear only in the late 17th century, even in Europe. So this notion of boundedness and line making is something that is a early modern phenomenon. Why maps? Procrastinating during my PhD. Someone sent me a map to figure out. I kind of figured out most of it, although I'm still finding things out about that map, more on Sunday. But that was 20 odd years ago, and I've been wondering, thinking that somebody as directionally challenged as myself should learn more about maps. Maybe it will help the way I do history. Thank you.
It's just past 7 o'clock, so I'm going to use my authority here to bring our discussion to a close. So you may continue to ask questions of Professor Samira Sheikh. Thank you very much for a fantastic masterclass in visual literacy. I think what Sadanand Vyas did in some way anthropologically for his friend, you've taken us to a historical visual sort of literacy class. I want to specially thank the archives at NCBS. We have a wonderful relationship with them as we are building our own Law and Society archives. Though OJS may not have been awake for the match last night, we were texting sort of furiously on WhatsApp about our own archive space. Venkat and Deepika have also been on campus to help us sort of assess where we are and where we need to get to. So I'm very glad to welcome them again. So thank you, Dr. Sheikh, thank you, NCBS. In closing, I'll just say there's a cafeteria near the main gate, so if you want to get a cup of chai, you can. The restrooms are at the back of the room, the ladies and the gents. Have a good evening, and I hope we will see you again at NLS for our other events. Thank you.